In 1999, a small chapel hidden deep within the Oregon woods was quietly sealed off after a suspicious fire claimed the lives of 12 children, or so the town believed. But 25 years later, a curious student uncovers satellite images that reignite the case, leading to a chilling discovery beneath the forest floor. The air was thick with pine and silence as Ben stepped over the rotting threshold of history. The rain had just stopped in Portland, and the scent of wet concrete still lingered in the air as Ben Miller leaned over his laptop. The soft hum of the old desk fan in his bedroom competed with the tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. A sophomore at Westview High, Ben wasn't exactly the most enthusiastic student, except when it came to geography. His current assignment? Trace local geographic changes in your family's hometown over time using Google Earth tools. It sounded boring to most kids, but to Ben, it was an excuse to dig through satellite imagery, historical overlays, and metadata, his version of digital treasure hunting. He asked his mom, Rachel Miller, where she grew up. She paused for a moment, then muttered, "Silverbrook. It's about 3 hours south. Haven't thought about that place in years." She didn't offer much else. Her face went a light tide, like someone remembering a place they'd locked away. That alone made Ben more curious. Silverbrook, Oregon, population under 3,000, barely a dot on the map. The moment Ben typed it into Google Earth, a cluster of small streets appeared, overlaid with dated photos of rural homes, old cars, and dense surrounding forest. The kind of sleepy place where time seemed to stop. He switched to satellite view, zooming out to get a lay of the land. River to the north, what looked like untouched forest land. He zoomed in further. His project instructions said to find patterns, changes in vegetation or construction, erosion, man-made interventions. But what caught Ben's eye had nothing to do with erosion. It was a faint structure, more like a smudge, right at the forest's edge. The satellite image was slightly blurry in that spot, but he could make out something angular. Curious, he switched to historical view and scrolled back to images from 2005, then 1998. There it was again, this time clearer. A small building with what looked like a cross-shaped stone structure in front of it. The image gave him chills. The roof was sunken in, overtaken by moss, and trees surrounded it on all sides. It looked like a forgotten church or chapel, but there were no roads leading to it, no name, no marker. He tried to street view it, nothing. The path just stopped dead before the trees. He zoomed in on the current image and noticed something strange. Despite the decades, the building's shape hadn't changed at all, like it was preserved, hidden. He quickly called out, "Mom, did you ever go to church in Silverbrook?" There was a long pause before she answered from the kitchen. "Why?" Ben turned the laptop so she could see. "I found this on Google Maps. It's at the western edge of the forest. Look," he pointed at the roof line, the faint outline of the stone cross. "It looks like a chapel or something." His mom stepped into the room and glanced at the screen. The color drained from her face. "Turn that off," she said, voice sharp. "Don't mess around with that place." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, confused. "That's not a place for you to be looking at. It's nothing. It's just old ruins." Ben had never seen his mother rattled like this. He turned back to the screen, screenshotting the image while she walked out. Something about the way she said, "that place," stuck with him. He did what any curious teenager would do. He opened Reddit. In a small Oregon thread, he searched for Silverbrook Chapel. No result. Then he searched Silverbrook Missing, and one post from a decade ago popped up. It was from a user named @Northwoods_ghost, who claimed, "There used to be a church outside Silverbrook. It burned down in '98 after some kids went missing. No one talks about it. Locals say it's haunted. Don't go there." Ben's heart pounded onto something, not just an abandoned building, but maybe a buried story. A secret. That night, when his mom went to bed early, Ben stayed up researching. Old newspaper archives, scanned microfiche from the Silverbrook Library, and finally, an old police bulletin posted in 1998. 3 miners unaccounted for following forest fire near Silverbrook perimeter. Fire suspected to originate near abandoned house of worship. That was it. The same building. Ben didn't sleep that night. He pulled out a notebook and started jotting down coordinates, date stamps, Reddit quotes. He had no idea what he was uncovering, but his gut told him this wasn't just for class anymore. The next morning, he printed out the image from Google Earth, tucked it into his folder, and as he left for school, he looked at his mom sipping coffee by the window. She looked tired, haunted. Maybe she had been there. Maybe she knew more than she'd ever told him. And maybe, just maybe, that forgotten chapel held the key to something much bigger than anyone in Silverbrook ever wanted to remember. Rachel Miller didn't flinch often, but when her eyes met the faint outline of the chapel on Ben's laptop screen, something primal surfaced in her expression. Fear, immediate and unfiltered. She reached over without a word and closed the lid, her fingers trembling slightly. "You shouldn't be looking at that," she said, her voice low, almost mechanical. "What's wrong? It's just an old building." She shook her head. "It's not just a building, Ben. It doesn't exist anymore. You hear me? Forget you ever saw it." She turned away, leaving him in a room that now felt colder than it had moments ago. But Ben couldn't let it go. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the sound of his mother's soft footsteps upstairs had faded, he powered his laptop back on. The eerie satellite image glowed against the darkness of his room, casting pale light across his face. Something about her reaction told him this wasn't just some old family memory. There was weight behind it. History. Maybe trauma. He opened a new tab and dove deeper. The local county archive had digitized some of its older land and property records, mostly unremarkable farmland transfers and zoning permits, but after nearly 2 hours of searching, a pattern emerged. A pattern of land on the edge of the forest west of Silverbrook was listed under multiple names across decades: St. Elijah's Chapel in 1962, then Silverbrook Community Trust in 1984, and finally just Parcel 94Z, Public Wilderness, no development authorized, by 1999. There were no ownership claims, no demolition permits, just silence after 1998. That stood out. Curious, Ben cross-referenced Parcel 94Z with local news archives. He scrolled through yellowed scans of newspaper clippings from the Silverbrook Gazette. Most headlines were dull: sports scores, high school plays, the annual Lumberjack Festival. But then one, dated July 17, 1998, stopped him cold. Fire ravages forest edge. Authorities investigate cause. No mention of casualties. No follow-up articles. He searched harder, switching to regional publications. Finally, in the archives of the Oregon Sentinel, a single blurb appeared in the back of a Sunday edition from the same week. Unconfirmed reports suggest that a fire may have originated near an abandoned structure formerly used for religious gatherings. No official comment from Silverbrook PD. Investigation ongoing. Then nothing. No names, no arrests, no explanation. It was as if the event had been swallowed whole. Ben sat back in his chair, the silence of his room now ringing with the weight of what he was beginning to piece together. He typed Silverbrook Chapel Fire, 1998, into Reddit again. This time, buried in an old thread discussing haunted places in Oregon, he found a comment that chilled him to his core. User at Old Crow's Nest had written, "Used to be a chapel out near Silverbrook, burned down mysteriously in '98. Rumors say it wasn't just fire. Kids went missing, town covered it up. Don't ask locals, they won't talk." Ben's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He reread the comment twice, his heart pounding. His mother hadn't just wanted him to stop looking, she needed him to. Something had happened there, something she either couldn't face or was too afraid to speak about. The chapel hadn't been erased, it had been buried. He checked the timestamp. The comment had been posted 8 years ago. The user hadn't posted since. Ben copied the username and tried messaging them anyway. "Hey, I'm researching that chapel near Silverbrook. I think my mom knows something. Can you tell me what you know?" He hit send, though he doubted he'd get a reply. The next day at school, he could barely focus. During lunch, he slipped into the library and opened a school Chromebook. His inbox was empty, but his head buzzed with unanswered questions. He decided he needed a map, an actual paper one. He checked out a topographical survey of the Silverbrook area from the geography section. The forest was marked with elevation lines, landmarks, and outdated foot trails. In the far western corner, just within the boundary of the map, was a faded square symbol with the words "Structure, Abandoned," scribbled in a nearly invisible font. No label, no name. Just a presence, hidden in print, like it was in digital view. He marked it with a red pen. When he got home, he tried again to talk to his mom. "I'm not trying to upset you," he said cautiously, "but why are you so afraid of that place? What happened in 1998? She froze by the sink, her hand, water still running. "I told you to leave it alone, Ben." "But you were there, weren't you?" he pressed. "You knew that chapel. You were in Silverbrook when it burned down." She turned slowly, eyes red, jaw clenched. "Don't ever ask me about that again. Do you understand?" And then she walked out the back door, into the yard, leaving the dish in the sink and the faucet running. That night, as Ben stared at the dot he'd marked on his map, a message pinged on his Reddit inbox. From @OldCrowsNest. The message was short. "If you want answers, don't talk to the police. They won't help. Look up Eleanor Grady. She used to run the town records. She kept the real files in her basement. Ask about the blue ledger." Ben reread it 3 times. A name, a lead, a ledger. He wrote them all down in the margin of his notebook. The date, 1998. The name, Eleanor Grady. And the question he could no longer ignore. What happened to the children in that chapel, and why was his mother so terrified to remember? He had no idea yet that the next step would take him somewhere much darker than pixels on a screen. Ben stared at the message from @OldCrowsNest like it was a map to buried treasure, though instead of gold, it offered something far heavier: truth. The name Eleanor Grady pulsed in his mind as he opened a new browser tab. A quick search led him to a local obituary. Eleanor Grady, 87, longtime resident of Silverbrook, former teacher, librarian, and town records assistant, passed peacefully at home in 2017. His heart dropped a little. Dead. But her name was now more than just a lead. It was a tether to the past, and every tether had a knot worth pulling. He dug further, managed by her granddaughter, Julia Grady, now living in Salem. The blog mostly featured stories about rural Oregon life, photos of old schoolhouses, and anecdotes about small-town eccentricities. But one post stood out, dated May 2018. "My grandmother kept everything: report cards, birth records, maps, even things the town tried to forget. We found boxes in her basement labeled Town Ledger Backups. I haven't had the heart to open them all yet." Ben messaged her instantly. "Hi Julia, my name is Ben. I'm researching Silverbrook's history for a school project. I saw your post about your grandmother's archives. I believe she may have had files about a chapel fire in 1998. Do you still have those boxes?" He hit send, nerves buzzing with email. "May I ask why?" Ben debated, then decided honesty was the only currency that mattered. "Because my mom was there. I think she survived whatever happened, but she won't talk about it. Please." The typing bubble appeared, paused, then returned. "I remember something strange about that file. One ledger was blue, handwritten, not typed. There was an entry from July 1998. It wasn't about a fire. It was labeled Special Order, Earthfill. I didn't know what that meant, but I can scan it if you want." Ben's chest tightened. "Please." 20 minutes later, a blurry scan popped into his inbox. It was a page from an old municipal record, scribbled in blue ink. July 22, 1998. Special order from Town Manager Horace Linney. Subject, Parcel 94Z, Earthfill Deployment. Approved. Authorization, Emergency Infrastructure/Security Compromise. Contractor C. Lindholm and Sons. Do not publicize. Ben read it 3 times. The words struck him like an iron bar to the chest. Earthfill deployment. Concealment. Not burned, buried. He felt dizzy. This wasn't just about a building. This was an orchestrated cover-up. He scrolled down to the next image Julia sent. A note attached to the ledger. Do not open with public copies. There had been an intentional effort to keep this separate from public archives. Something about that building terrified someone enough to bury it rather than destroy it. He thanked Julia and closed the laptop, pacing his room. His mom hadn't survived a fire. She had survived something much worse. That night, as the autumn wind pushed tree branches against the windowpane, Ben crept into the attic, where old boxes were kept, his mom's childhood things, moved from her late parents' house years ago. Dust hung thick in the air as he sifted through them. Yearbooks, faded birthday cards, a plastic tiara from a 4th grade play. Then, beneath a stack of old books, he found a shoebox labeled Rachel 9699. Inside were crayon drawings, Polaroids, and one faded journal. The cover read, "Summer Thoughts," in childish handwriting. Carefully, Ben flipped through the pages. Most were innocent, camp songs, friendship lists, but one page stopped him cold. July 15. Today, Pastor Malcolm said we'll all become bright. He gave us white robes, said we'll sleep in the quiet until the world's ready. He told us not to be afraid if we hear the ground moving. That means it's working. Ben's head trembled. Another entry, July 18. We sang inside the chapel today. The stone floor was cold, the walls shook a little. Pastor Malcolm said we were waking the old voice. He smiled a lot. One more entry, July 20. They locked the doors. We weren't allowed out until Pastor came back. Anna cried. Pastor said she's not ready. She got taken to the basement. I don't want to be bright anymore. Then the journal stopped. No further pages. Ben backed away from the box, heart thudding like a hammer against his ribs. He was holding the voice of his mother, the little girl trapped inside that chapel, one of many who had been planned of some horrifying ritual disguised as worship. Something had been planned, not a fire, not an accident. A quiet burial of lives and memory. And somehow Rachel Miller had made it out. But how? And why her? The next day, while his mom was at work, Ben returned to the Reddit thread. He decided to ask directly, using a throwaway account. What really happened at the chapel in 1998? Within minutes a reply came, not from @Old Crow's Nest, but a new user, @StrayFlack. You're not the first to ask. It wasn't fire. The building was sealed. Kids were inside. One got out. That's why they buried it. Check. Ben froze. One got out. That had to be his mom. He replied, Do you know her name? Silence. Then, she drew a spiral on the floor. That's how they found her. Blood spiral. They said she did it herself. Ben slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in his throat. Spiral. The same shape from her childhood sketchbook. He remembered it now. He'd seen it once when he was 8, doodled on the back of an old math worksheet. He'd thought it was a doodle, just a swirl. Now he knew better. That evening, Rachel came home early. She seemed calmer than usual, but tired. Ben sat across from her at the kitchen table, the journal in his lap, hidden beneath his hoodie. Mom, he said, voice low. Did you know a girl named Anna? She froze. Her spoon clattered into the sink. Then slowly she turned to face him. Her voice cracked. I thought I forgot that name. Ben swallowed hard. You didn't. You just buried it. Her face crumpled, and for the first time in years she looked less like a mother and more like someone barely holding herself together. Ben, she whispered, they said I was the lucky one, but I never knew why. She stood up and left the room, but I never knew why. She stood up and left the room, but I never knew why. He had his answer, or at least the beginning of it. The chapel hadn't burned. It had been buried alive, and one girl had clawed her way back, and now that truth was clawing its way to the surface again. Ben didn't sleep that night. The conversation with his mother played on loop in his head like a broken recording, her voice barely above a whisper. The way she said, they told me I was the lucky one, the visible unraveling of her composure, the distant look in her eyes that didn't return even when he tried asking more questions. Something in her broke open, but instead of answers, it poured out silence. The next morning, Ben took the map he had marked and the coordinates he had collected and texted his best friend Max. I need your help, no questions, meet me behind the gym at lunch. Max was skeptical at first, but after Ben showed him the satellite image, the journal entries, and the town record scan mentioning Earthfield deployment, his resistance melted into stunned curiosity. Max had always been the most cautious of the two, but also the most loyal. If Ben said they needed to sneak into a forest 3 hours away to find a buried chapel, Max didn't argue. He grabbed his flashlight and GoPro. They left at dawn on Saturday, telling their parents they were headed to a science fair in Eugene. Ben had already memorized the route, plotted the turnoff from the main highway, and located the deer trail that supposedly led to Parcel 94Z. It wasn't on any modern GPS, but topographic maps from the ADS showed a logging road that came within a few hundred feet of the property boundary. By noon, they were deep into Silverbrook Forest. The trees here were thicker, the air cooler, and the ground increasingly uneven as they moved off-path. Birds grew quieter the further they ventured. Even Max noticed. "It's like the place doesn't want us here," he joked half-heartedly, but the tension in his voice betrayed the attempt at humor. After nearly an hour of hiking, Ben stopped. "This is it," he whispered, pulling out a printed satellite photo and comparing it to the clearing ahead. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a lichen-covered hill. But as they circled it, a distinct geometry revealed itself, straight lines where nature should have been chaotic. The hill wasn't a hill at all, it was a roof. They had found it. The chapel hadn't burned, it had been buried beneath soil and moss and time, like a scar beneath skin. The stone cross Ben had seen in the 1998 satellite images had broken off, half sunken into the dirt. The structure itself, though weathered, was intact, gray stone peeking out from beneath layers of decaying vegetation. Ben approached the front, brushing away vines from what appeared to be a door. Rusted hinges groaned as he pushed against it, the weight of years resisting. Max aimed the flashlight into the dark interior, and immediately both boys froze. Lining the stone walls of the chapel were figures, at least 20 of them. Children, or what looked like children, but they didn't move. They didn't breathe. "They're statues," Max said quietly, moving closer. "But not marble, not wood." Ben stepped beside him, peering at the nearest figure. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, her face frozen in a half-smile, her arms outstretched as if in greeting. The detail was uncanny. Hair strands molded in wax, fingernails, even the faint suggestion of veins beneath translucent skin. It was too lifelike, too real. "They're wearing uniforms," Ben muttered, recognizing the crest stitched onto one of the navy blue jumpers. He pulled out a copy of his mom's 4th-grade yearbook photo, one she had reluctantly shown him once. The crest matched. St. Elijah's private school, Silverbrook's only religious school in the 90s, shut down in 1999. Max scanned the room with his GoPro while Ben moved to another row of figures. Every one of them had slight differences, facial expressions, hairstyles, stances, but their eyes were identical, open, glossy, terrified. He knelt by a boy slumped beside the pulpit. A label was etched onto a sack of breastplate. "They nailed them," Ben said, "like exhibits." Max's light landed on something near the altar, a stack of folded robes, still white, covered in dust, and a Bible cracked open to the book of Job. Next to it, a candle had melted into the shape of a spine. "Ben," Max whispered, "we need to leave." But Ben couldn't move. His hand hovered over the pew. He reached out and touched the arm of one of the wax figures. It was cold, softer than he expected. His stomach turned. "This doesn't feel like wax," he muttered. Max backed up, his breath quickening. "Ben, we need to go now." Ben nodded, snapping out of the trance. They started filming the entire room, panning across each figure, zooming in on the nameplates, capturing the decayed remnants of hymn books, the rotting piano in the corner, the fragments of drawings taped to the stone walls. Crayon stick figures, stars, something else. Spurls. Ben recognized them. Identical to the one in his mother's journal. They had been drawn again and again in the margins of every page. "It's the same," he said, voice hollow. "She was here." They made their way to the back of the chapel, where a staircase led downward into pitch black. Max refused to go further, but Ben aimed the flashlight down, filming as far as the light could reach. Rows of shelves, glass jars, a faint smell sickly sweet like decaying fruit. He couldn't bring himself to descend. Not yet. They returned to the surface, sealing the chapel door behind them as best they could, covering it with branches and moss. They didn't speak until they reached the car, where Max collapsed into the passenger seat, pale and shaking. "That wasn't just a church," he whispered. "That was a tomb." Ben drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His mind raced with images, the statues, the eyes, the Bible, the spiral. And the last thing he saw before shutting the chapel door. A plaque above the altar, almost hidden behind rotting garlands. "The bright shall sleep until the world is ready." Ben and Max sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before either of them could speak. The weight of what they had seen clung to their skin like smoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was saturated with dread, disbelief, and an unspoken understanding that this was far bigger than them now. As they reached the outskirts of Portland later that evening, Ben parked in a quiet lot near an old gas station and opened his laptop. He inserted the memory card from Max's GoPro and played the footage, checking for clarity, making sure the statues, the nameplates, the robes, the altar, and the horrifying staircase were all visible. They were, every detail, captured in unforgiving resolution. Max leaned over and muttered, "We can't keep this to ourselves. People need to know." Ben agreed, but he didn't want it traced back to them. Not yet. Not while his mom was still a nervous wreck, not while they were still minors, and certainly not while they had no idea who had covered this up for over 2 decades. So he created a burner email account, one not tied to his phone, and uploaded the video to an encrypted drive with a timed access link. Then he wrote a simple message. Anonymous source, location, Western Silverbrook Forest, coordinates embedded in metadata, footage from inside a buried religious site believed to be connected to the 1998 missing children case. Please investigate. He sent the email to 4 local newsrooms, including Channel 8, Oregon Investigates, known for its coverage of cold cases. They didn't sleep that night. The next morning, it was already on the 7 a.m. news. Shocking discovery in Silverbrook Forest, the anchor said, visibly shaken. An anonymous tip has led authorities to what appears to be a hidden chapel containing wax effigies of children wearing school uniforms and what may be evidence of a mass grave. The footage you're about to see may be disturbing. The segment blurred parts of the video but kept the essential elements: statues, name tags, symbols, and the chilling inscription above the altar. By noon, it was national. Ben and Max watched in stunned silence as helicopters buzzed over Silverbrook and law enforcement sealed off the forest with yellow tape. Town, once forgotten, was now swarming with reporters and crime scene investigators. In interviews, the town sheriff, Douglas Meyer, maintained a calm but visibly troubled demeanor. "We are treating this as a potential historic crime scene involving multiple victims. The area is currently under forensic excavation, and we're collaborating with state and federal agencies to identify all possible remains." Ben's heart raced. He had never expected it to move this fast. Within 48 hours, authorities began digging beneath the chapel floor. News choppers captured the excavation site from above as ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies below the surface, irregular cavities and heat signatures inconsistent with natural soil composition. What they found was worse than Ben had imagined. On day 3 of the dig, Channel 8 confirmed that skeletal remains had been uncovered in what appeared to be a subterranean crypt beneath the chapel. 12 child skeletons were recovered, wrapped in deteriorated white cloth that matched the robes seen in the video. Some were partially entombed in crumpled wooden boxes, others laid directly in the earth. The news reports avoided speculation, but word spread quickly. The remains were likely connected to the infamous 1998 chapel fire case, the same case that had been quietly closed with no physical evidence, no arrests, and a narrative that insisted the chapel had been destroyed in the blaze. DNA tests were rushed, and within a week, the Oregon Department of Justice held a press conference. Having confirmed, the spokesperson said solemnly, that 12 of the remains found match DNA profiles of children listed as missing in 1998 from the Silverbrook area. These children were previously believed to have perished in a structural fire. However, we now have conclusive evidence suggesting their bodies were intentionally buried beneath the structure, which remained largely intact. The announcement sent shockwaves through the state. Memorials went up, old case files were reopened. Parents of the lost children, now older, grayer, some moved to different states, were flown in and given private briefings. Tears flowed freely at the site where floral wreaths began to pile beside the police barricades. But for Ben, it wasn't enough. He knew there had been more than 12 children in the chapel that day. His mother's journal mentioned names beyond those listed in the memorials: Anna, Pastor Malcolm, others unnamed. He felt it in his bones that there were more secrets under that ground, that someone had ensured the story ended neatly at 12. Max, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. "What if they trace the footage back to us?" he said one night, pacing Ben's room. "What if whoever did this is still out there, still watching?" Ben understood the fear, but what frightened him more wasn't retaliation. It was the idea that even after all this exposure, the full truth might still stay buried. He kept scanning Reddit forums and underground chat threads. One post caught his eye. Buried in a dark web forum for whistleblowers and amateur sleuths was a new thread titled, "Silverbrook wasn't a cult, it was containment." The post claimed to be written by someone with first-hand knowledge of the chapel, asserting that the children weren't sacrificed, they were isolated. The claim was cryptic. The children weren't the danger, the him was. The spiral was a lock, and one girl broke it. Ben's blood ran cold. He clicked the username. The only other post? A comment from 6 months earlier. "If the spiral reopens, it doesn't end at 12. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. He thought about the staircase under the chapel, the one they never descended, the shelves, the jars, the smell. He had only filmed from the top step. There had been more, so much more. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Rachel sat on the living room couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the muted television which continued to play coverage of the Silverbrook discovery on a loop. She hadn't spoken much since the DNA results were announced. The news that 12 children had been found, children she knew, children she had drawn spirals with and shared whispered songs in the chapel basement, had shattered something deep inside her. But what truly broke her was the list, the one Ben printed from the DOJ's website, the one that named the 12 recovered children. Her name wasn't on it. Rachel Miller was not listed among the missing, nor the found. Ben placed the paper gently on the coffee table, unsure of how to say what needed to be said. "I double-checked," he began, his voice soft. "There's no mention of you in any report from 1998. Not in school records, not in the police logs, not even in the local census. You're not on any survivor list, Mom." Rachel didn't move, but her eyes finally shifted from the TV to her son. "That's not possible. I was there. They said I was in a hospital in Eugene, that I was found wandering outside the forest and brought in with hypothermia and amnesia. They showed me a chart. I remember the chart." Ben hesitated. "I looked for that hospital." She blinked. "What I called the state archives, they have no record of a St. Martin's Trauma Recovery Center ever existing in Eugene or anywhere in Oregon." Her breath caught in her throat. "It was on my discharge papers." "I checked those too," he said gently. "The documents you have, they're forged, Mom. The state seal is outdated, the medical license number doesn't match any physician on record." Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the manila folder she had kept for decades, the one with her only link to that missing chapter of her childhood. Inside were several photocopied forms, a basic intake sheet, a psychological evaluation, and a discharge notice. But now, under Ben's scrutiny, they looked cheap, like theater props. "Then where was I?" she whispered, her voice thin. Ben didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a printout he had been keeping in his backpack. It was a scanned medical intake from 1998, obtained through an encrypted forum that archived off-grid documents. It came from a facility called the House of Stillness, located in a secluded area of southern Washington just across the Oregon border. Rachel scanned the paper. Her name was there, typed clearly at the top, followed by her date of birth and a list of intake symptoms: confusion, selective mutism, recurring visual hallucinations, religious fixation, high sensitivity to auditory stimuli. Her photo was attached, a grainy, wide-eyed girl wrapped in a thin blanket. "They didn't send me to a hospital," she muttered, clutching the paper. "They sent me to a religious asylum." Ben nodded grimly. The House of Stillness was run by the Restoration Path Fellowship. They claimed to be a therapeutic religious order, but records show they were flagged by the state in 2001 for operating without medical licenses. They were known for taking in spiritually afflicted youths, especially from cult rescues. They shut down after a whistleblower exposed their use of silence rooms and aversion therapy. Rachel looked like she might vomit. Her fingers dug into the couch cushions. "That's where they took me? After the chapel?" "That's where They wiped you clean," Ben said. "They erased your history, gave you a new story, and made you believe it. That's why you have no memory of what happened after the fire." "It's not your fault." Rachel's breathing grew shallow. They told me I had been abandoned, that I wandered into the woods during a storm. They said my parents were dead. And they gave you a new name, Ben said. Rachel Miller wasn't your birth name. I found your adoption paperwork. You were re-registered in 2000 as a ward of the state, placed with a foster family in Roseburg. Your original name was Lydia Grange. She stared at him, blinking hard. That sounds familiar. Ben sat beside her. There's more, he said carefully. The fellowship's records were partially recovered by an investigative journalist in 2005. I contacted her. She sent me a file. One of the intake forms described a girl brought in from an incident site connected to a collapsed religious structure. Voices said she was the only one found alive, singing a hymn in an unknown language, drawing spirals in her own blood. Rachel recoiled. No, I wouldn't. It said you were in a fugue state, that you were preserved for observation because of your resistance to sedation. Why would they do that? She asked, her voice cracking. Because they didn't think you were a victim, Ben said. They thought you were part of it, maybe even the center of it. That's insane. Is it? Ben asked, his eyes scanning hers. They buried the chapel, covered up 12 deaths, and you, somehow, walked out. Not one scratch, just singing. Rachel shook her head violently, as if trying to dislodge the idea, but then she whispered, I still hear it sometimes? The melody, in dreams. Ben hesitated before speaking again. The journalist also found sketches from the other patients at that facility. Some drew the chapel, some drew the spiral, but one drew you. Said you were the hem girl. The one who survived the brightening. Rachel stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. No, stop. I don't want to hear any more. Mom, no, she screamed, eyes wild. That place is gone. I got out. I built a life. You don't understand what it was like. I had no past, no family, just nightmares and whispers and cold white walls. Her hands clenched into fists. If I wasn't in the fire, if I was part of something else, then who the hell am I? Ben looked down, unable to answer. Outside, a cold wind picked up, rattling the window pane. But inside that small house, there was no sound beyond the small house. There was no sound beyond the small house. There was no sound beyond the small house. There was no sound beyond the freezing with Ellen. The story had reached national attention by now, flooding news cycles, late-night panels, and true crime podcasts. The media had officially branded the Silverbrook case as one of the darkest religious cover-ups in modern Oregon history. After Ben's anonymous footage, the DNA confirming up for justice grew deafening. While federal agents swept the ruins of the chapel for additional evidence, investigative journalists took to digging through old personnel files, property transactions, and clerical rosters. One name began surfacing repeatedly: Reverend Malcolm Cray. His was a name Rachel didn't remember, at least not consciously. But when Ben showed her an old, faded photo of a middle-aged man in a dark casket with heavy-lidded eyes and a peculiar, knowing smile, she recoiled instinctively and whispered, "That's him." Reverend Cray had presided over St. Elijah's Chapel in Silverbrook during the 1990s and was quietly reassigned to an out-of-state parish shortly after the alleged fire in 1998. His name had disappeared from public records after 2001, but not completely. Digging through archived court dockets from neighboring Nevada, one journalist uncovered a sealed juvenile protection case from 2004 involving a man by that same name, charged with coercive psychological influence over minors at a religious retreat. The charges had been dropped due to insufficient physical evidence and the voluntary nature of the participants' enrollment. But it was enough to open the gates. The FBI, now overseeing the Silverbrook investigation, used this lead to track him down. They found Reverend Cray living in a reclusive desert commune under the alias Martin Lynn. When they arrived at the compound, 4 trailers encircling a crude chapel structure, Cray did not resist. In fact, he opened the door with a calm smile and simply said, "I wondered how long it would take." His arrest was made without incident, but his confession, recorded during a 6-hour federal interrogation, shook even the most seasoned agents. Cray admitted to orchestrating what he called the brightening at St. Elijah's Chapel. According to him, the ritual was not intended to harm, but to protect the purity of selected children from the corrosive chaos of the modern world. He explained it as a spiritual seclusion, a metaphysical pause, their preparation for a renewed age of innocence. "Eth did not kill them," he insisted. "We liberated them from noise, from time, from the scream of the world. They were not buried, they were sanctified." When asked about the physical remains found beneath the chapel, Cray's demeanor shifted. He grew defensive, claiming that others interfered. He spoke vaguely of higher forces and internal betrayal, accusing unnamed parties of misinterpreting the rite and rushing the sealing. But he never denied that 12 children died. "They weren't strong enough to hold the hymn," he murmured. "Some minds crack under clarity." He acknowledged Rachel, under her birth name, Lydia Grange, as the vessel. He described her as the only child who could withstand the full harmonic resonance of the ritual. According to Cray, her survival was not accidental, but essential. "The hymn needed a witness," he said, "someone to remember, someone to carry the spiral into the next cycle." Cray's words were surreal, wrapped in theological delusion, but investigators found supporting documents inside his trailer: handwritten journals, diagrams of ritual sequences, music notations scrawled alongside childlike sketches. Most damning were the photographs, old Polaroids showing rows of children in robes standing beneath the same chapel altar, many of their faces later identified from the recovered remains. When this evidence was shown to Rachel, she went pale and could barely breathe. One photo showed her in the front row, eyes wide, spiral inked onto her forehead. It took her several minutes to speak. "I remember the song now," she whispered. It wasn't in English, but it felt like it knew me. Prosecutors prepared a formal case against Cray within days. Though the statute of limitations complicated several charges, the discovery of a mass grave and new witness testimony allowed federal prosecutors to move forward with indictments for negligent homicide, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted outside the old Silverbrook Town Hall, demanding accountability from local officials who had signed the Earthfill Order in 1998. 3 former city managers were subpoenaed, and one quietly resigned from a current government post in Salem. Cray's legal team attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing religious psychosis and severe delusion, but a psychological evaluation confirmed he was fully competent. In court transcripts later leaked to the press, Cray expressed no remorse, he said. "I call them transformed. The world was never ready for them, but she was." The room went silent when he nodded at Rachel, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom. She didn't flinch, but her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ben sat beside her, his arm around her shoulder, anchoring her to the moment. As media pressure mounted, more former residents of Silverbrook came forward. Teachers, neighbors, even a retired postman, all claimed they had suspicions but were pressured to remain silent. The town had been economically reliant on church-affiliated grants and community restoration funding provided by the same religious network Cray had once represented. Financial records suggested hush money had circulated for years, but none of it explained why the state had allowed the House of Stillness to reprogram a traumatized survivor and reintroduce her to society under a fabricated identity. That, Ben realized, would be the next layer to uncover, because as horrific as Cray's revelations were, there were still questions hanging unanswered. Who authorized Rachel's placement in that off-grid facility? Who forged her medical files? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if she was chosen to carry the spiral, what did that actually mean? The trial was still weeks away, but the town of Silverbrook had already become a spectacle of reporters, angry crowds, and government agents attempting to pick through decades of buried truths. While the headlines focused on Reverend Cray and the charges stacking up against former officials, Rachel Miller, or rather Lydia Grange, had retreated from the noise. The storm outside had quieted, but the one inside her had only just begun. At Ben's insistence, and with approval from the DOJ Trauma Response Unit, Rachel agreed to undergo a guided hypnotherapy session with Dr. Ellis, a forensic psychologist specializing in repressed memory retrieval. The sessions took place in a secure facility outside Salem, in a room with soft lighting and no clocks. Rachel sat in a reclining chair with her eyes closed, electrodes gently fixed to her temples to monitor stress patterns. Dr. Ellis's voice was soft, deliberate, steady. "You are safe. Nothing here can harm you. We are only revisiting a memory, not reliving it." It took nearly 3 sessions before her mind began to unseal. The first memories were fragments, flashes of cold stone beneath her bare feet, the smell of candle wax and rotting cloth, the low hum of dozens of voices chanting in rhythm. Then came the stairs, the spiral drawn in red, and a sudden sensation of pressure in her skull, as though something had bloomed inside it. But the 4th session unlocked the clearest image yet. "There were 3 of them," Rachel whispered, her eyes still closed. Adults, not from the chapel. They wore suits. One had a clipboard. They didn't kneel like the others. They stood above us like they were choosing. "Choosing what?" Dr. Ellis asked gently. Rachel's lips parted. "Purity. They said they needed one with lineage, the pure line." Said I had the mark. "What mark?" "Behind my left ear," she murmured, reaching instinctively to touch the spot. "A tiny spiral. Birthmark." Rachel said it was divine inheritance. "They called me the resonant." Dr. Ellis nodded slowly. "And what did they do next?" "They took me upstairs. The other kids screamed. Pastor Malcolm tried to stop them. He yelled something about disrupting the ceremony. But they had authority, even over him. They injected me with something. I don't remember what happened after that." Ben sat behind the observation glass with clenched fists. Hearing his mother speak like this, calm, distant, detached, made the hairs on his arms stand up. Betraylian continued. "Do you remember where you went next?" Rachel was quiet for a long time. Her breathing slowed. Then, walls, lots of flowers, a woman with dark hair. She smiled too much. She said I was reborn, that I was chosen. They gave me a new name, said my old life was pain and that forgetting was a gift. "Did they say why you were chosen?" Rachel opened her eyes. "Because I wouldn't break." The spiral mark was later confirmed. A dermatologist at Portland General Hospital identified a faint, naturally occurring pattern of raised skin behind Rachel's ear, subtle but real. Genetic testing revealed something else. Rachel's mitochondrial DNA contained rare markers associated with a genetic subgroup found in isolated communities from the Appalachian region, known for unusually high cognitive empathy and anomalous auditory processing. Traits once dismissed as eccentricity were now reclassified as neurological sensitivity. A detail buried in the old House of Stillness files, recovered through DOJ subpoena, referred to Gene Class D9, elevated harmonic suppliant. Rachel had been part of a study, unethical, hidden, and linked to a larger web of experimental child reprogramming carried out under the guise of religious therapy. The program that erased her past wasn't just about psychological recovery. It was a calculated attempt to suppress a lineage. Rachel had been sent to live with a foster family in Klamath Falls, under an alias at age 10. The file noted her condition as persistent dissociation, high responsiveness to guided suggestion, no recall of pre-adoption history. The family, now deceased, had been paid through a grant, listed under a now-defunct nonprofit called the Children's Path Initiative. IRS records later showed the organization received over $2 million in funding from a private donor group known only as the Foundation for Cognitive Stewardship, the same foundation that had once funded Cray's Chapel. When Ben read these details, he could barely contain his rage. Every line in the report felt like another nail driven into a coffin of silence that had been built around his mother for decades. But Rachel didn't cry when she heard it. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap. "They knew what I was before I did," she said. "They didn't want to heal me. They wanted to contain me." Dr. Ellis nodded. "And do you remember anything about the hymn, the melody?" Rachel hesitated. "It wasn't in any language I know, but it felt mathematical, like it lived in the spaces between words, like it could rearrange the air." Ben shivered as he watched her speak. "Can you still hear it now?" the doctor asked. Rachel blinked. "Only when I'm alone." Later that night, Ben and Rachel sat outside under the porch light. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and a dog barked somewhere down the road. "They built your life," Ben said quietly. "They chose who you were allowed to be." "I know," Rachel whispered, "but now I choose who I am." Ben handed her the journal she had once kept as a child, the one he found in the attic. She held it for a long time, tracing her fingers across the warped cover. "I remember writing this," she murmured. "They told me it was fantasy, that none of it was real. But it was. All of it." "You survived," Ben said. "That matters." Rachel nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Surviving is just the beginning, Ben. They didn't just bury those children. They buried something else too. And I think I'm starting to remember what it was." Ben didn't speak. He just watched her, knowing that whatever came next would demand more than answers. It would demand truth, no matter how deep it was buried. The morning air was sharp with October wind as Ben stepped through the caution tape once again, escorted by Agent Rayner, one of the federal officers now overseeing the Silverbrook crime scene. Despite the ruins being classified as an active investigation zone, Ben had been granted limited access due to his role in initiating the discovery. It wasn't a privilege he took lightly. He walked carefully through the warped remains of the chapel's main floor, flashlight in hand, the floorboards groaning faintly beneath his steps. Beneath the weight of so much history, the air still felt charged, like the silence wasn't just emptiness, but something waiting. He approached the back stairwell, the one he and Max had once only dared to film from above, and descended for the first time. It smelled of mildew and rust. The air was colder down here, dense with moisture and memory. The basement was surprisingly intact, with rows of broken shelving, wax residue, and traces of rotted fabrics that might once have been ceremonial robes. He moved slowly, eyes scanning every surface, every corner, every trace of what had been. That's when he saw it, wedged beneath a collapsed shelf near the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. A thin silver chain, tangled in half-buried debert. Ben crouched and reached for it, discolored with time but still bearing an engraving. He flipped it open. Inside was a name etched in delicate script, Lydia G. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He turned the locket over, heart pounding. On the back, in barely legible letters, was a date, May 12, 1988, his mother's birthday. No one could have known that detail unless it belonged to her. This wasn't just a remnant, it was proof, tangible, physical confirmation that she had been here, that she had survived, and that she had once been Lydia Grange before they turned her into someone else. He took out his phone and snapped a photo, hands trembling, then slipped the locket gently into a plastic evidence bag. "I think I found something," he told Agent Rayner upstairs. The agent took the bag carefully, nodding. "We'll have it processed, but it looks like you were right all along." That night, Ben returned home and showed his mother the photo. Rachel stared at it for a long time before taking it from his hands. "This was mine," she whispered. "My father gave it to me before he—" Her voice trailed off. "Before what?" Ben asked gently. Rachel's fingers clenched around the print. "Before he stopped believing we were going to be saved." A week later, the Department of Justice held a private memorial service in Silverbrook for the families of the 12 children confirmed through DNA. It wasn't large, but it was solemn, filled with quiet tears, long embraces, and the cathartic release of names finally spoken aloud. No more euphemisms, no more vague disappearances. The children were identified, honored, and laid to rest. Ben and Rachel attended together, standing apart from the crowd at first, unsure of how to belong in a gathering of such painful reunion. But one by one, the parents approached them. An older couple in worn coats thanked Rachel for surviving. "Because of you, we have a place to mourn our son," they said. Another woman, holding a faded school photo of her daughter, hugged Ben and whispered, "If you hadn't gone looking, we'd still be waiting for someone to do what you did." Their gratitude was overwhelming, and for the first time in weeks, Ben saw something in his mother's eyes that hadn't been there before, a fragile, hesitant peace. Not closure, but perhaps a beginning. At the edge of the cemetery, a small plaque was unveiled. It bore the names of all 12 victims, etched in brass, with one blank space left beneath them. Someone had placed a wreath of white roses there. Ben looked at it and turned to his mom. "Do you think it's for you?" She shook her head. "No," she said. "I think it's for the part of me they buried and never thought would return." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the light turned golden, Rachel took Ben back to the house and handed him the journal again. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. "After the ritual, before the men in suits took me, Reverend Cray whispered something in my ear. He said the hymn was never about salvation, it was about separation. He said I would carry the song until the silence came back." Ben frowned. "What does that mean?" Rachel looked at him, eyes distant. "I think he meant I wasn't the last." A chill ran down Ben's spine. He remembered the messages on the dark web forum, the cryptic warnings about containment and resonance. The phrase, "It doesn't end at 12, echoed again in his mind. "Do you still hear the song?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Not in words, in moments, in light patterns, in dreams. Sometimes I wake up and the room is hung." Ben felt the weight of her words settle in the air between them. The trauma hadn't just been physical or emotional, it had been something deeper, something woven into her very perception. He opened the journal and flipped to the final page. There was a drawing he hadn't noticed before. A spiral, of course, but this one wasn't like the others. It had 12 rings, each filled with a name, but in the center there was a 13th. No name, just a question mark. Ben traced it with his finger. "What if there was another?" he whispered. Rachel didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her silence said enough. The machines came in late November, long after the last forensic team had cleared the site, after the final bones had been laid to rest and the courtroom had emptied of its ghosts. Heavy equipment, donated by the state's emergency fund, arrived in a solemn convoy. The chapel's shell, which once loomed in shadow and secrecy, was now slated for full demolition, not erased, but acknowledged, dismantled under the watchful eyes of both law enforcement and the families whose lives had been tethered to its foundations. Rachel stood with Ben just beyond the safety barrier, her coat wrapped tight against the bitter wind as she watched the walls of her childhood fall in pieces. There was no cheering, no applause, just the thunderous collapse of stone and decades of silence. The ground where the chapel once stood was cleared down to the soil, purified not through fire or lies but by deliberate human hands. In its place, the state, in coordination with the families and local preservationists, constructed a modest memorial, a circle of engraved stones bearing each child's name, positioned around a single white cross at the center. Not religious by design, the cross was chosen because it had once been the most visible part of the chapel from the air, the symbol Ben had first seen on Google Maps. Now it stood not for dogma, but for remembrance. The site was named the Circle of Bright, a phrase taken from one of Rachel's recovered journal entries and redefined by the parents as a way to honor the light their children once brought into the world. Each year, on the date of the chapel's discovery, a ceremony would be held there, not with hymns or prayers, but with the reading of each child's name, followed by a moment of collective silence. Ben was invited to speak at the first dedication. He stood at a makeshift podium, nervously clutching a folded speech in his hands. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he spoke, not about horror or revenge, but about responsibility, about memory, and the courage to ask questions when no one else will. His words were quoted in newspapers across the state. When truth is buried, it doesn't die. It waits, and sometimes it waits for someone young enough not to know they should be afraid of digging. 2 weeks later, Ben received a formal letter from the governor's office. He had been nominated for the Youth Action for Justice Award, a state-level recognition given annually to individuals under 21 who had demonstrated outstanding bravery and contribution to civil integrity. The ceremony was held in Salem's state capitol, attended by lawmakers, educators, and journalists. Rachel sat front row as Ben accepted the plaque. In his short acceptance speech, he thanked his mother not just for surviving, but for choosing to remember. That night, as they returned home, Ben opened his laptop one last time and pulled up Google Maps. He typed in the old coordinates by instinct, fingers moving from memory. The forest loaded slowly, dense and green and seemingly untouched. But the image was no longer what it had once been. The gray smudge that marked the chapel was gone. The satellite view showed nothing but treetops now, clean and complete. But as he zoomed closer, where the building used to stand, something new appeared. A small white shape in the center of the clearing, just barely visible but unmistakable. A cross. The new memorial, the chapel, was gone, erased from the present, but preserved through remembrance. Ben leaned back in his chair, a strange mix of peace and sorrow settling over him. He clicked on the marker that had replaced the site. A user-submitted tag now read, "The Circle of Bright in memory of the 12." There were comments beneath it, left by strangers and friends alike. Gone but not forgotten. "My brother's name is there. Thank you. Visited this place. You can still feel something sacred." Ben didn't leave a comment. He didn't need to. The work had already spoken for itself. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the bare branches against the window. Rachel passed by his doorway, pausing to glance in. "You looking at it again?" she asked gently. He nodded. "It looks different now." "It is different," she said. "Because of you." He turned to her, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. A real, unbroken smile, small but radiant. "Are you okay?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "I'm remembering without breaking. That's new." Ben closed the laptop. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer haunted. It was full of something else, resolve perhaps, or the quiet satisfaction of having pulled truth from the shadows and set it where the world could finally see. As he turned off the light and lay back in bed, his thoughts drifted not to the chapel's secrets, but to the tree line beyond it, the sound of wind through the pines, and the lone white cross that now stood in the clearing like a beacon, simple, silent, eternal. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more chilling mysteries brought back from the shadows. Which part of the story left you speechless? Was it the discovery in the chapel's basement, or the moment Ben uncovered the truth about his mother? Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from. We're always amazed to see how far these stories reach.